I'm humbled by the interest that most people in the world have had in the American election, because in America, cocooned as we are in a culture that has no direct borders with a competitive rival, and is cocooned by its history from the sad histories that many countries have experienced, we often forget how important our elections are to not just ourselves, but to the free world. But as someone who's been engaged over the last few months in analyzing this election, I have found that it is in fact of intense interest across the globe, from India to Australia to Estonia and Latvia. About the only foreign countries that have not asked my opinion are those of Russia and the People's Republic of China. And perhaps one need not dally as to why that might be the case. But it's true that when America coughs, the world catches cold. And I think what's scaring people is looking at this election and thinking that not only may America be coughing, but in fact America, because of the choice before it, is terminally ill. What I'd like to try and do is give you some hope, which is to say that much of what's happening in this election is an idiosyncratic result. It's not the reflection of an American illness or the reflection of an American desire to completely change its policies towards itself and towards the rest of the world, but rather an American expression of many of the same issues and challenges that are facing countries throughout the developed world, including here in Hungary. I would like to explain first how we got to the point where we have two candidates who, neither of whom are appealing to a majority of Americans for the first time, really, in American modern political history. How did these two flawed people become the nominees of the two large parties in the United States? Next, I'd like to move into where the state of the race stands now, and what, although one cannot predict with certainty, 7 weeks out, what will happen, in part because of what former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called known unknowns and unknown unknowns. We simply don't know how candidates will react under stress or pressure, or what world events or domestic events will arise that can change people's minds. But nevertheless, there's rather constant factors that are at play that tend to favor Mrs. Clinton, and I'll explain what those are and why they tend to favor Mrs. Clinton. And then the final thing I'd like to do is briefly try and sketch out for you what a Trump or a Clinton presidency might mean, not simply for Hungarians, but for the general free world of which America is kindly or not so kindly recognized to be the leading country of. These candidates have very different temperaments, they have very different constituencies, and are likely, if they were to win, to present very different faces of America to the rest of the world. So I'd like to go into that and just briefly sketch out what some of those differences and probabilities will be. Going back to the beginning, if you had said, if somebody came back in time and or popped up in front, materialized in front of you right now and said, I've been through a time machine, and I've been through, and they'd done this last year, and they'd said, it's October of 2016, and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are running for the presidency. Not only would you have considered that time travel would be impossible, but after that sort of prognostication, you'd be certain that this person was certifiably insane. How did this come to pass? The thing to remember about American political parties is that, unlike any other political party in the developed world, the party leaders do not determine who the party leaders are. If you're in a parliamentary party, whether either the parliamentary members or some slightly expanded subset of party activists determine who the party leader is. Even in Gerald's native Britain, which right now is under, the Labour Party is undergoing a rather contentious contest for the leadership, it will be decided by roughly 500,000 people who pay dues to the Labour Party out of a country of, say, 60 million people. This is not the case in the United States. The United States holds what are is the most open, fluid, permeable system to determine who the leader of the party is of any national democracy. You have what are called primary elections that are open to anyone. They are open to anyone who is a registered voter or chooses to become a registered voter, whether or not that person has ever voted before in their life, whether or not that person has any allegiance or activity to a political party at all, or whether or not that person continues to hold allegiance to one political party but chooses, for whatever their personal reasons are, to participate in the primary of the party who he or she despises. The system is that open. And what these candidates did was present themselves to the entire American people over the rolling span of a year. And the elections that are held for primary elections actually took place over the span of 6 months. So they have already presented themselves, and over 1/2 of the people who will cast a ballot in the fall have already cast a ballot for or against one of these candidates in their primaries. For Mrs. Clinton, the task was the inverse of what it was for Donald Trump. She was the candidate of the Democratic Party establishment. She was the person who was considered to be the heir apparent to President Obama. And so consequently, no one of any standing within the Democratic Party felt that they could challenge her. The only person who could challenge her, who chose to challenge her, was somebody who had never even been part of the Democratic Party until 2 months before he decided to get involved in the race. He had always been an independent outside of the Democratic Party who called himself a socialist. So at the age of 70, Bernie Sanders decided that he was going to become a member of the Democratic Party for the sole and exclusive purpose of trying to take that party over from what, in an American standpoint, would be considered the left. He was essentially launching a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party from the left. Mrs. Clinton was able to see that challenge off in large part because of 3 factors. First, as somebody who commanded the center-left of the Democratic Party, she commanded the broad sense of acceptability among the largest group of Democratic voters. Mr. Sanders, coming from the left, could get intense passion among those who felt that the Democratic Party had become too centrist, had become too beholden to corporate interests, and no longer represented egalitarian values. But they were a minority within the Democratic Party. The second thing that she was able to do was maintain the loyalty of a group of people who saw her as their personal champion. She is going to be 69 or 70 years old. She was part of an early wave of feminists, people who broke down many legal, social, and economic barriers in American life. And for women of that age, people who were part of that first group who broke down those barriers, she is their champion. Much as Mitt Romney, had he been elected president, would have been the first Mormon in the White House, and even Mormons who were not disposed towards the Republican Party felt pride in the achievement that a co-religionist would finally occupy the White House. Much as Barack Obama, even though he was not descended of American slaves, his father was Kenyan. Despite that, the fact that he was going to be the first person of color to occupy the White House excited many African Americans. So too, among educated women of over the age of 50, they viewed her as their champion, and they moved into the Democratic electorate for the sole purpose of supporting her. And that provided a bedrock group of support that Mr. Sanders could never erase. The third factor that saw her through was the fact that she appealed to the largest single group of a very fractured political party, which is African American voters. The African American population in America is about 1 in 8. About 12% of Americans are African American, but they are so democratically leaning that they comprise nearly 1 in 4 of the Democratic Party. And they, for a host of reasons, not the least of which, that she loyally served the first African American president, they were impervious to Bernie Sanders' charms. They supported her by margins of between 2-1 and 9-1, depending on the state. And once you have those groups in play, you have centrist Democrats, you have a certain group of women who will support you no matter what, and you have the African Americans, that is close to a majority of the Democratic Party simply by itself. Bernie Sanders attracted a lot of attention. He mobilized a lot of people. He was, in fact, the choice of people who were choosing to vote in the Democratic Party primary process but were not loyal Democrats. But they were a minority. He could not mobilize enough people to move into the Democratic Party to overcome these very strong advantages that she had. And even though it appeared to be a relatively close-run thing, in fact, she had a relatively comfortable victory. It was pretty clear as early as mid-February that she was going to be the nominee, absent some sort of interfering event like an indictment. The exact opposite happened in the Republican Party. There was no one favorite of all of the leading centrist factions. Instead, there were 16 candidates who represented every flavor of republicanism known to man. They disagreed with one another. They could not command not even a plurality support of the Republican Party. And prior to Donald Trump, it was expected to be the longest and most hard-fought Republican primary campaign, perhaps in history. Enter into that a man who did what nobody had thought could be done. He mobilized a core constituency and brought them in what Bernie Sanders could not do, which was bring tens of millions of people who were not loyal Democrats into the Democratic Party. Donald Trump brought millions of people who were not Republican Party activists into the Republican Party primary. What he essentially did was mobilize the sort of person who in the continent will vote for what we would know as protest populist parties, the sort of person who in Germany votes for AfD, the sort of person who in England votes for UKIP, the sort of person who here flirts between being some sort of populist version of Fidesz or somebody who supports Jobbik. These people supported Donald Trump with a passion. And they came into the Republican Party, even if they had never, ever been a Republican before, in states that required them to change their registration. They declared themselves Republicans. In other places, they came out. And even though there was no semblance of a traditional campaign, no organization, no television ads, no captains running around trying to get you out to vote, they saw that this was a person who they felt had their back. This was a person who felt they shared their values, and this was a person who they would go and do things they had never done before, simply to bring him to the White House. Now, the constituency that he mobilized was only he got 13 million votes in the end. That's about 1 in 10 of the total American electorate. But the Republican Party is the smaller of the two parties. So one-tenth of the entire American electorate was enough to be roughly 45% of the smaller Republican electorate. And the Republican rules, unlike the Democratic Party rules, means that if you win pluralities, you can win with 38% or 40% of the vote. But in many states, that means you get 100% of what are called delegates at the party convention. So Donald Trump could win states with 38% of the vote, largely on the backs of people who are not college graduates, who are not even traditionally loyal Republicans, but are animated by grievance about their standing in the cultural and economic challenges of our times. And he could win 100% of the delegates, and consequently, he was able to, with a small segment of American society, effectively launch a hostile takeover of the second largest political party in the free world. Now, in the course of doing that, he found something out that actually he's only recently come to really understand, which is that in the private sector, if you get 20% market share, you're a billionaire. In the public sector, in the American system, where you must get 50% of the vote in order to win a general election, you're a loser. He focused on mobilizing and intensely getting the support of 20 to 30% of Americans, but he did so on terms that alienated 65% of Americans. And throughout the last few months, he's been continually conducting an untraditional campaign that has the effect of reminding the 30% who love him why they love him, and reminding what at one time was 65% why they don't. And for that reason, as recently as a month ago, he was significantly behind Mrs. Clinton. Even though more people disliked Mrs. Clinton than liked her, even more people disliked Donald Trump. As recently as a month ago, American political polls said that Mrs. Clinton was viewed favorably by about 43% of Americans and viewed unfavorably by about 54%. So we've never had a major party candidate who was at that stage in a campaign, so viewed negatively as Mrs. Clinton. But she was running against somebody who was viewed positively by only 30% and viewed unfavorably by 60% or more. His negatives, as of a month ago, were a net minus 30. This was a historic low. What it meant was that there were as many as 1 in 5 American voters who did not like either candidate and intensely did not like either candidate. Now, in American politics, getting to the factors that shape the election, you must remember that the parties are not evenly balanced. Approximately 5 to 7% more Americans say they are loyal Democrats than say they are loyal Republicans. So that means that if Mrs. Clinton can unify the partisan Democrat, Donald Trump can unify the partisan Republicans, but he still starts out 5 to 7 points behind Mrs. Clinton. And that's roughly where it stood in the public polls until about a month ago. He had brought together, despite all of the intellectuals who oppose him in the Republican Party, he had basically unified Republican voters behind him. And despite all of the people on the Bernie Sanders wing who were saying that she was unacceptable, she had basically made enough concessions to them that loyal Democrats were behind her. And she had a 6.5-point lead in the polls. What's happened in the last 3 weeks is 2 things. First, between Mrs. Clinton, more revelations about her emails. And I can go into what those are, but basically, it's been leaking out over the last year and a half that she used a private server to handle official State Department correspondence, and in the course of that, and in the course of a legal investigation, it appears that a foundation set up by her husband and by her family that had been operating at the same time was soliciting contributions on the implicit promise that the donors would get meetings with the Secretary of State, which for some reason is of interest to foreign governments. Who knew? So some more of those emails came out, and some more of her lack of transparency with respect to what she was doing came out, and that slightly hurt her among some people. Seconded with the fact that she collapsed at a rally, and she had not previously disclosed that she was suffering from an illness, but after she publicly collapsed at a rally, it was disclosed that she was suffering from pneumonia. And again, this fed this idea that Mrs. Clinton can't be trusted, that when it comes to her activities and her beliefs, she won't be forthcoming, she won't be transparent. This hurt her on the margin. Her favorable ratings went down slightly, her unfavorables went up slightly, but not hugely. What has changed is that Donald Trump has been running a different type of campaign. That a month ago, he had been told for months, you have to stop trying to appeal only to 30%, you have to try to appeal to 50%. And he had been resisting doing that. And then he changes his campaign staff and hires people who are known for appealing to even a smaller group than he was trying to appeal to. So people thought, well, he's going to suddenly become even more narrow in his approach than he has been. Instead, he's been exactly the opposite. He's stopped saying offensive things on a regular basis on his Twitter account. He has been more measured in his public pronouncements. He has given speeches that were written for him as opposed to giving a free, standing, off-the-cuff discussion, which was his primary modes of communication before. And much to my surprise, his favorability ratings have been on a steady rise, and his unfavorable ratings have been on a steady decline. A month ago, as I mentioned, he had been upside down, as we would say, by 30 points. As of this morning, he was upside down by only about 20 points. Now, he's still less favorably viewed than Mrs. Clinton. The partisan advantage still works against him. He is still behind in the polls. He needs to change more things in order to win than she needs to change. All of this points to Mrs. Clinton eventually being elected president, albeit by a much closer margin than we would have suggested. What you should expect to see over the next couple of months is a few things. First, there are 4 discrete voter blocks in America that are either changing their patterns of behavior that they've held for over 20 years in response to the specific candidates before them, or one voter bloc whose unusual attraction to President Obama has helped Democrats and whom Mrs. Clinton needs to energize in the same way. Donald Trump has been getting support record for a Republican among white voters who did not graduate from American University. This means that places that have a high proportion of those are becoming more Republican than they had been in the past. And these voters' loyalty or apathy is what allowed a relatively unpopular President Obama to win re-election. The states in the American Midwest, regions, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, all places where these voters are a large percentage of the electorate, they are all looking like they will be more Republican this time than they were 4 years ago. That's good for Donald Trump. However, the converse is true, is that typically Republican candidates do well with whites who have graduated from a university. These people find Donald Trump's views anathema. They have been moving towards Hillary Clinton, or they are deciding which candidate is less objectionable to them. And so she is leading historically in the polls among this group, the first Democrat who looks like she might be able to win this group. So what that means is that states with a high proportion of these voters, such as Virginia, such as North Carolina, such as Colorado, look like they're becoming more Democrat than they were. So that means that some states that a normal Republican might possibly pick up, like Virginia, look outside of Donald Trump's reach. And a state that Mitt Romney won narrowly, North Carolina, looks like it could be won by Mrs. Clinton because the large number of college-educated whites who live in North Carolina tend not to like Donald Trump and his policies. The third voter group is people of Hispanic descent, largely people who are immigrants from Mexico. Donald Trump has made international news with his anti-immigration views, his belief that Mexicans are largely criminals, people that he will build a wall, he will send all the Mexicans home, he will build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it. For some reason, Mexicans living in the United States don't particularly care for this man. There are some states where Mexicans Mexican immigrants to the United States are a large enough part of the electorate that they are likely to both turn out in larger numbers and vote for Mrs. Clinton in larger numbers than they voted for President Obama. That will move those states towards the Democrats. States like Colorado, states like Nevada, states like Arizona. So what you're seeing is those three factors coming into play. And then the fourth factor is the African American vote. The African American vote typically is the most single loyal constituency of any size for any party in America. The African American vote typically votes 90 to 95% for a Democratic presidential candidate. That's a margin of between 9-1 and 20-1, depending on the race. What Barack Obama did was increase their voting share. Not only did they vote by that margin, but they voted in record numbers. If Mrs. Clinton can continue those two things, winning 90% of the vote and getting record numbers to turn out for her, that means that all of these states in the Midwest, which have large African American populations, with the exception of Iowa, are likelier to be held for her. Those are the four voter blocks that you will see. And what you will see is the candidates basically fighting over those voter blocks. Donald Trump, in his latest iteration, has learned that he needs to compete for those voters. So suddenly he has started to tone down his rhetoric on immigration. He has made a major speech saying that he favors paid family leave, which is something that is meant to attract college-educated women, the sort of people who are most resistant to voting for him. He's even attended African American church services to try and tell African American voters, you don't need to be afraid of me, which either sends the message it's okay to vote for you or it's okay not to turn out because you don't need to be scared. Either one, either result is good for him. A vote that doesn't show up in an African neighborhood is basically a vote for Trump because of the high likelihood that that person would otherwise vote for the Democrat. Mrs. Clinton, on the other hand, continually runs ads and continually focuses on issues that will tell moderate Republicans who are college educated that why they shouldn't like Donald Trump. Yes, you might have voted for Mitt Romney. Yes, you might have voted for John McCain. Yes, you may never have voted before for a Democratic candidate, but this time matters. This guy's a nut. You can't support him. That's been a major issue of her campaign. And the second thing is she needs to mobilize Latino turnout and tell Mexicans that it's important to turn out so that they can keep states in the Democratic column and perhaps put Arizona in her column as well. How is this race going to unfold? It's likely going to be A, extremely nasty. According to one recent poll, 20% of Americans like neither candidate. That's never happened before. And among that 20% who like neither candidate, 64% of them are not expressing a preference right now. So basically, 13% of Americans look and they say, I've got somebody here who I can't stand, I've got somebody here who I can't stand, I have to choose between two people that I can't stand. And here I have to quote the American comedian Woody Allen and adapt it for this election. He used to tell a joke, and I'll adapt it to this, which is, more than any time in American politics, America faces a crossroad. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. 1 in 5 American voters feels that that applies to the choice before them. Eventually, they're going to have to choose. They're likely to choose on the basis of who they hate more than who they actually like. So you will likely see increasingly bitter denunciations of either candidate. As much as Donald Trump tries to run a positive campaign, at some point, unless he really turns things around, he's going to have to remind people why they hate Hillary Clinton. And she has been consistently focusing on why they should hate Donald Trump. What that means is that whoever wins is likely to win without any sort of a popular mandate. They may win the popular vote, but they will not win popular support. They will enter office with a higher share of the vote than they have people who actually think they ought to be in office. And that means whoever wins will govern from a weak popular standpoint. That means that the American president, whoever they win, whoever comes in, will be a weak president to start with. They have no popular support to draw on. There is no reason for any congressman on either party to go ahead and support that person's viewpoint because they're afraid of that person's popularity. That is particularly true of a Republican Congress with Hillary Clinton because they are naturally opposed to her viewpoints, and she will not have demonstrated the ability to show that there is a popular majority behind her campaign. It will simply be an anti-Trump majority, not a pro-Clinton majority. What does all of this mean for the rest of the world? Well, if Mrs. Clinton wins, you should think of her as the status quo candidate. She is somebody who is very safely within the consensus of the Democratic Party as it exists today. She is somebody who, for a host of reasons, is likelier to want to show that she is stronger, both domestically and internationally, than her predecessor. He is viewed by Democrats as being aloof domestically and weak internationally. They won't say that because he's their titular party leader, but that's the commonly held viewpoint. That means that she will likely try and reach out to her party in Congress and work more closely with them. And it also means that she's very likely to try, particularly after the scares that Donald Trump has brought about, try and reassure the American alliance, of which, since you are part of NATO, you are part of the American alliance, that America can be trusted and that America's word is her bond. Now, once she tries to do that, she will react to specific provocations or specific challenges. It's difficult to say. But I do think that particularly in the first year in office, she will be likelier to want to hold a decisive line and meet it, as opposed to committing the error that she and others believe Barack Obama committed in Syria, where he said that there was a red line which the Assad regime could not cross. And then when they crossed it, he redrew the line in another position. She will not want to repeat that mistake. Domestically, the Democratic Party wants to increase government spending, it wants to increase redistribution, it wants to increase, to some measure, regulation on large sectors of the economy, and it wants to raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans. She is likely to want to pursue that agenda in some way, and she will be bitterly resisted by the Republicans in Congress. There is one avenue which she could pursue that would be in her interest to do so should she feel strong enough, and that is there's a very large segment of the Republican Party that feels uncomfortable with the populist economics of Donald Trump and feels uncomfortable with the populist religiosity of much of the right wing. They would be open to working with a Clinton administration that seemed to understand their concerns. A Hillary Clinton that wants to govern from outside of the Democratic Party, which also would be what she would need to do in order to build a popular majority behind her, would be one that would reach out to these Republicans and basically say, well, if I cut corporate taxes, would you sign off on raising the capital gains rate for certain investors and the minimum wage? In other words, a kind of right-left partnership that ends up in the center. I don't know if she will do it. That would be in her long-term political interest. It would be a risky endeavor because she would need to be willing to face down the left wing of her party to bring that together. But if she were to pull that off, it would leave her in a much stronger position after the first year because she would begin to weaken the Republican coalition while at the same time beginning to unite the Democrats behind her vision for America as opposed to them uniting behind her because she is not representative of Trump's vision for America. Donald Trump, I believe, is ultimately unpredictable. This is a man who has spent all of his life, including when he was a teenager, resisting accountability. He was somebody who was kicked out of schools and sent to a military school by his authoritarian father so that he could shape up. He spent most of his 20s and 30s courting public attention by being out there, by being the sort of person who would get public attention by carrying on affairs and being a bon vivant around town. He carried on public image campaigns during his 40s and 50s, focused around reality television, again, designed to show that he's a man who's in charge, he's a willful guy, he's a leader, and leadership being defined for him as being the ability to make a deal based on his own interests and his own willfulness. And as he likes to tell us repeatedly, his own intelligence, because he's incredibly smart, as he will tell you on Twitter and elsewhere. What this means that unlike any other political leader in American history, were he to become the presidency, he would be untethered. He has no loyalty to the Republican Party, having only recently become a member of it. He's demonstrated no philosophical core to any particular idea, having been on both sides or all sides of an idea many times during the space of a day during this campaign. Going back and trying to explain different utterances and having his campaign trying to say, no, he didn't really mean that. He wasn't walking back his prior position when anybody with a brain could see he was walking back his prior position. What I think this means is that when this is a man who says he's going to cut deals and he's going to make decisions in the American interest, you should take him at his word. I don't think you can count on him to be somebody who believes that treaties bind him. I don't think you can count on him to be restrained by those who have conducted foreign policy in the past. I think it is a fiction, a willful hope, a willful delusion to think that the party grandees or the congressional leadership will restrain him. I think this is a man who has spent his life getting what he wants by breaking the rules when he has to and by setting the rules when he can, and I see no reason why a 71-year-old man should change his spots at this time in life, particularly when he achieved his greatest ambition against everyone's hopes, and particularly against the wishes of most of the people who he knows will be trying to restrain him. What that means is that the Trump presidency, particularly in foreign policy, will be unpredictable. And this is something also you have to understand about the American system. Because we have an independently elected executive, the president has very little constraints when it comes to foreign policy. There's no pressure that Congress can bring to bear on him that they would ever be willing to bring to bear on him short of impeachment. He can deploy American forces, and it will be highly unlikely that that will be overturned. If he can choose not to deploy American forces, and short of kicking him out of office, there's nothing the Congress can do about it. If he chose not to embrace an Article 5 commitment, it would require a bipartisan majority to kick him out of office for him to be forced to do so. He is an independent executive. A majority of a parliament or a majority of a party cannot remove him as any other leader in virtually any other country could happen. Conversely, what that means is he's very weak domestically. In parliamentary systems, many people feel constrained by the leader in order to go along with their domestic priorities, because in order to go against that person, you would need to have enough votes that would depose that person from office, once a leadership is installed, he has a great degree of ability to divert domestic and set domestic priorities in a parliamentary system. If the reason Donald Trump is relatively free in foreign policy is that he is independently elected and owes nothing to the Congress, the opposite is the case in domestic policy. These people are independently elected. It is very common for a president to say, I want X, and members of his own party to say, well, I want Y, and your proposals are dead on arrival. So the strength that he has in foreign policy is a weakness in domestic policy, and one should not necessarily expect that if he requires congressional approval for something that he will get it. Now, that being said, there are a number of things that he can do that have domestic impulses that are more like foreign policy. Should he, for example, choose to interpret many of our trading alliances or trading agreements differently, that would be more like in a foreign policy realm. There would be very little that a Congress could do to force him to do something. But if he wants a new spending program, he wants a tax cut, he wants a change in legislation to do something, that is something that requires congressional assent, and he is in a very weak position, particularly given how negatively he is viewed by most of Americans. Even today, he's in a very weak position to get any congressional action through that he would particularly want. In short, this is a very contentious election. It is a very consequential election. It is one that is likely to end up with the status quo being very tenuously reinforced. But anybody who wins, if Mrs. Clinton wins, she would be very ill-advised to think that she can ignore the demands of the core Trump constituency. Because if there's one thing that we've learned from the experience of many continental European countries is that if you ignore that constituency, if you try and isolate that constituency, it only grows. If the 10 to 15 to 20% of the people who love Donald Trump continue to feel ignored, continue to feel that they are belittled and outside of the American political system, they will not go away, they will radicalize. And as economic downturns occur, and America will have an economic downturn during Mrs. Clinton's administration. We have never gone in the modern era more than 9 years without a recession. It's been 7 years since we had one. We will have a downturn during her office. If she does nothing to help unify all of the country, if she tries to marginalize these supporters without Trump supporters, without trying to deal with their legitimate concerns, you will find Trumpism coming back in louder language and perhaps more dangerous form 4 years from now. And that, more than the prospect of President Trump, is something that should worry America's allies throughout the world. And with that, I'll take your questions.